Thank you all for being here. What a total pleasure to be able to join you. My name is Radden Keefe, and this is it's funny because they asked when they were putting together the program, they said, you know, who would you like to talk to? And I said, what about Hua Hsu and Larry Wright, which is just funny. I tactfully didn't mention that they're both colleagues of mine at the New Yorker. So think of this as an opportunity, not to watch a standard panel, but to eavesdrop on hopefully a warm conversation between friends and colleagues. I've reached an age now where nobody ever asks me anymore what I want to be when I grow up. I don't know when it happened, but at a certain point in your life it stops, and it's actually pretty depressing to reflect on. But if anybody ever did ask me who I wanted to be when I grow up, I would probably tell them Lawrence Wright. Larry is a longtime staff writer at the New Yorker, and somebody who's written how many books now?
It's 15 in the fall.
15 in the fall, including classics like The Looming Tower and Going Clear, and also, and we'll talk about this, writes novels and screenplays and plays and works across these different genres in really fascinating ways, and actually has a new novel that's about to come out, which we will talk about. Hua Hsu is another colleague who has written about a lot of different, almost anything kind of culturally that you can imagine. Hua has written about in fascinating, wide-ranging, penetrating ways, and also has written this really incredible memoir that I cannot commend to you strongly enough, Stay True, which received both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award, and is, I think, just a kind of a deeply original book in a whole bunch of ways, and also a deeply personal one, and we'll talk about that today. The subject here is literary nonfiction, and we all write for the New Yorker. We write different types of things, but I think that we're all working in a certain tradition, and it's a tradition that I cherish and hold dear and love. And it's also a tradition that I think in some ways might be a little bit in jeopardy out there in the world. And so today, my hope is that we can talk about the work that we do and how we came to do it, but also sell you on why it's valuable and important and worth paying a subscription price for and engaging with on a deep level. I think I want to start, though, by asking about, we all write for a magazine, and I think magazines mean something different in the culture now than they have in the past. And so for each of you, just when you were growing up, and why I know you came to magazines, for you it was like zines, it was a different moment in time. But like what magazines meant when you were coming of age, and at what point you became aware of the kind of writing that you see, not just in the New Yorker, but in other magazines, when that became a thing that you thought about and an aspiration that you had.
Well, thanks everyone for being here, and it's an incredible festival, and thanks to Larry and Patrick. It's very trippy actually to be on stage with both of you since you've been so influential to me. I think I'm 47 years old, so that means I was 13 going into the 1990s, which was sort of this golden age of like alternative culture. And I think for me, I came into the world of literary nonfiction, did not know the term existed, through reading music magazines, through reading zines. And for the early part of my published career, coming out of making zines, which were just little Xeroxed magazines that my friends and I would make, I was a music critic. And I think of criticism as a form of literary nonfiction. You're telling a story about a piece of art. You're trying to contextualize it. You're trying to make it meaningful. And so, in the 1990s, I was really into like Rolling Stone, Spin, Details. And for me, magazines were just this curated, kind of time-bound glimpse into a world beyond my Silicon Valley suburb. I grew up in Cupertino and in California, and it was just sort of, this was a cross-section of a different world. So I might pick up Rolling Stone to read about, Soundgarden or something, some band, but then there would always be some long feature, and it would be very intimidating but then you read the first paragraph, you're like, all right, maybe I'm old enough to read this now. And then you get 3 paragraphs in. It's sort of like, I still feel this way when I'm reading. Like, you build up that momentum, and then a page, and then maybe 500 words in, you're like, I need to know how this turns out. And so I think it was just sort of that accidental exposure. And I think that that's rare nowadays with experiences being so curated, that you pick up a magazine and the thing that you didn't know you wanted was there. So yeah, I can't really speak highly enough of like that run of like Details. There's this magazine out of the UK, The Face, I read a lot, and it was just real consciousness expanding at the time.
You know, I'm 40 years older, so I grew up in a different era, and the New Yorker was it. You know, it was after the Algonquin Round Table, but you know, they've still had this mystique about it, and somehow it made a small living on selling things like sandals and summer camp stuff. You know, the ads were this big, but there were a lot of them, and it was an aspiration that I scarcely had the nerve to utter. You know, that I would write for the New Yorker, or write at all. But during Vietnam, I was a conscientious objector, and I had to do 2 years of alternative service, and I wound up in Cairo teaching at the American University in Cairo. So when I got back to the U.S., I decided I'm going to write for the New Yorker now. So I wrote Letter from Cairo, and poured out all my adventures over the 2 years that I was there. And I was in a little lake house in North Texas, and walked out. Back then, copy machines were practically unknown. So I sent the whole manuscript in a manila thing, and went out to the RFD.
The only copy.
Yeah, the only copy.
Oh boy.
The RFD mailbox, and raised the red flag for the postman. And so somehow it went from Quitman, Texas to New York to William Shawn's desk, and back to Quitman the next day. And fortunately, they sent the manuscript back, but it was very thoughtful of them. But I thought, this is going to take a little longer than I thought. But at least I had announced to myself what I wanted to do. And
Did they have? Was it a note? Was there a note? Was there an
Yeah, there
explanation?
was a rejection card. You know, in my perverse early days, I papered one of my file cabinets with the rejection slips, and this was at the top, but they had the courtesy to write "sorry" at the bottom of it. And then I was writing for Rolling Stone, and Rolling Stone and I are just, you know, different countries, and so I was invited for, I think it was the 25th anniversary, and the dinner at the Four Seasons, you know, and that I had just written my first article for the New Yorker, and it was about Ross Perot, and I had been in the office to meet my editor, and you know, I was so enchanted. And she said, well, we'd like for you to do some more work with us. And I said, I'd love to, but you know, Rolling Stone's offered me a contract, and I have children, and you know, I've got.
So how old are you at this point?
45. And she said, well, let's see what we can do about that. By lunchtime, I had a contract with the New Yorker. So I went to the Four Seasons for the Rolling Stone thing that they had paid for me to come up. And back then, you know, no cell phones, so to go down to the men's room where the phone bank is, and I called my wife and, Roberta, I got a job at the New Yorker. And she said, well, if that's what you want. I said, do you know me at all? How long have we been married? You know? So I went back upstairs to, you know, go into the big dinner, and what's your name? Lawrence Wright. Oh, no, you're on the dessert list. I am? So what am I supposed to do with myself? Well, you can wait in the bar. So I went into the bar, and there was one other reject, John F. Kennedy Jr. So I felt a little bitter, you know. So I was we were consoling each other, and suddenly the door to the dining room bursts open, and out comes Hunter S. Thompson and Keith Richards. And Hunter's got his, cigarette thing, and Keith is right on his shoulder, and Hunter, bartender, paper, and starts scribbling. I said to Keith, what's going on? Oh, Jan Winter, he just insulted the man. I said, what did he do? Well, he did a portrait of Jan, and he took it out in his backyard in Woody Creek, Colorado, and shotgunned it and sprayed it with blood. And then he gave it to him. And Jan refused it because Yoko Ono was sitting at the table. I thought, God, I got to get out of here. So anyway, it was a transition for me.
I was going to say, because a lot of other people would have had that experience and called the New Yorker back and said, I don't want the job after all. I'll stay right here. And what was the, so when you talk about criticism as a kind of literary nonfiction, I mean, what does literary nonfiction mean to you? How would you distinguish that from other, like what is the literary quality?
That's a tough question for me. I guess for me, it's just about storytelling and just a bit more, just pursuing it in a more artful or more intentional way. I mean, I think the thing about, not that the panel is all about the New Yorker, but it's sort of, I think one of the things I really appreciate about it is that you can really take your time getting into the story or getting into what it is you're writing, whether it's a book review or a feature or a profile. And so I guess the literary quality is just sort of drawing on different influences. It's not a newspaper article that's just influenced by being a newspaper person. It's being able to weave in musical inspiration or novelistic inspiration. And so I don't know, it's a freedom that I don't think I really appreciated or sought when I was younger. I don't think I had any real ambition because I thought it was just so impossible. And so I guess now I'm grateful to have that chance.
Impossible in the sense, like technically impossible in the sense that you would struggle to do it, or impossible in the sense that you would never be the kind of person who would get that job?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah, both.
Yeah.
I think that, it's funny, I was telling Larry earlier that I read The Looming Tower on my honeymoon.
Okay, couldn't find anything better to do.
And it's a book about
your poor wife.
It's about the origins of Al-Qaeda, right? So it's sort of not, it's not really the book people bring to like a resort in Thailand, usually. But I was just so enraptured, and it just really opened up this portal for me. I mean, I think I just didn't know that you could do that you could sort of tell history, tell the present, tell the story of the present in ways that that are so narratively propulsive. And so I think for me, I would read things like that, and I thought, like, first of all, I could never figure out like how to report something, and second of all, the storytelling part of it is also sort of beyond me too. And so I think for me, when I was younger, I just really did not, and who knows if I know how to do it now, but it's something that I just, it just seemed like magic to me.
And yet now you do it. Like, how did you? So walk us through the sort of second half of the origin story here.
I guess about 10 years ago, I got a call to write some music pieces for the magazine because they were looking for a new music critic, and I was just very fortunate because I think I sort of got in the door right when the New Yorker was trying to build their website out. So they were interested in sort of more diverse perspectives, different kinds of coverage. And I think people who'd had that job before would just be locked into being the music critic. Like, you couldn't pitch other kinds of stories. But I just happened to get there at a time when editors were willing to hear you out if you wanted to write about fashion, or if you wanted to write, like I wrote a big piece about affirmative action. Mm-hmm. And even though I was the pop critic, people recognized that I could report this story on affirmative action. And I just really credit the editorial infrastructure there and sort of the people I work with. I mean, we were talking before about our editors and sort of the different relationships we can have with them. But I mean, my editor really taught me how to do my job now. And I think that not only is journalism in peril and all these things, but that level of professionalism and that level of institutional knowledge, just institutions in general sometimes, it's also sort of in peril. And so, I don't know, I really credit my editors for recognizing that I had a brain to do certain things, and then sort of telling me like, you should go out to lunch with this person, pick this person's brain, and just sort of going from there.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that I always think about coming up in magazines, because and I may have it wrong, and there may be newspaper people in the room here, but my kind of envious impression, my like grass is greener impression of people who came up in newspapers was that you're like the cub reporter, and there's the grizzled old veteran who like takes you out for whiskey at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday and kind of schools you in how it's all done. The great Robert Caro, published this memoir about his early days as a reporter, and he has this famous story about working at Newsday on Long Island, and like the city desk editor, like the investigations editor, takes him aside, and his advice to Robert Caro is turn every damn page. And the strange thing about magazines is it's much more, at least the New Yorkers, it's much more atomized. You don't, like, I learned by reading, I mean, it sounds like you did too, by reading people like Larry, where you actually, it's like you watch the magic trick and you have to try and figure out how it was, you sort of reverse engineer it. A lot of my education came from doing that more than anything else. While when you've written a lot of criticism, but then you also write these great profiles of artists. I mean, you recently had a terrific profile of Richard Powers, the novelist, but you've profiled musicians. Is it a different part of your brain? Like when you listen to a record or you go to a concert and you're writing about it in one way, and then when you actually sit in the room with the person, I've just noticed for myself, and I do a very different kind of writing, but in a strange way, it's like if I'm writing about you, if I say to you, I'm going to do a big story about you, and you can talk to me or you can not talk to me, and even if you don't talk to me, I'm going to write about you anyway. I think it's almost always a good idea for you to talk to me, because it'll be harder for me to see you as, I think when you sit down across from someone and you sort of see them in their completeness, you see them as a human being, just inevitably, I think you end up giving them a slightly, you look on them more favorably. Right. It's hard for me not to. And I just wonder for you whether there's any kind of, is there like a sort of church and state part of your brain where it's a little weird to like review somebody's record and then meet them and get to know them and write about them and then review another record on the other side of that?
I was just chuckling thinking about if I had approached like Richard Powers that way and said, you can talk to me or not.
Yeah.
I'm going to write about you anyways. And he's an author, so it would be very strange. But I think the weird part for me is like I was writing about pop culture for so long. I was writing about hip hop in particular for so long. And I would have these conversations with an artist where I would say like track 4, you're doing this, and then you get to track 7 and this comes back, and then it all comes together in track 11. And then the person would look at me and be like, no, it just sounded good. Or like, you're wrong, like that is not at all like what was intended. And now that I've written this memoir, that people will do that to me. Like they'll say, when you use this word on page 7 and then 7 pages in the end, the word comes back, that was really cool. And I say, that does sound cool. It was not intentional. But like now I feel in this hokey way as though your experience is just as valid as what I intended. And so I think the reason I stopped writing criticism as much is because now that I have this experience and this kind of openness to just anyone's experience of art, it changed my ability to just kind of levy some critical opinion in ways that didn't take into account just chance or randomness. I love profiling people just because it's the great thing of journalism is you can just have conversations with people that you wouldn't otherwise have a conversation with. It's just satisfies that part of my brain that's very introverted, but when I'm working, that's when I can pick up the phone. That's when I can ask you questions that that I'm curious about life and the world and things like that. And so, the church and state thing is becoming a lot squishier than it used to.
And it was. And Larry, one thing that I've always admired and been so fascinated by in your career is you have ranged across these different mediums. So you're doing like very hard-hitting and narrative investigative articles and books, but then also writing novels periodically, and you've written movies, and you've worked in documentaries, and you're in a band. I mean, what does the man not do? But I wonder, in terms of all of the different types of narratives you work in, I guess I have two questions for you. One is, are these things in conversation? Like, is it when you're writing Hollywood screenplays, does that inform the way you then write a nonfiction book, or vice versa? And then also, how do you decide? Like you mentioned, and we're going to get to your memoir and your novel, but you mentioned earlier that, if I'm not mistaken, the novel that you're about to publish started as a screenplay that didn't get made, and you couldn't quite crack it, and then it became a novel, and now it's this other thing. So when you kind of come into something, when you have an idea, how do you decide what it wants to be?
I used to think that, when you have that moment of, I want to do this, which is the rarest and most important thing in the whole process, is what are you going to do? What are you going to write? And the truth is, there aren't that many things you're going to write, but you have to give yourself to things that you're willing to spend a year, 5 years, so it's an important decision. But it comes to you and says, I'm a New Yorker article. I'm a nonfiction book. I'm a novel. I'm a screenplay. I'm a play. And I thought, the truth is, you can take that packaging off. If you have a story, it can be any of those things. And the story is the most important part of the whole thing. I think a lot of writers miss that. For instance, Hollywood the archives are full of unmade movies that would be great novels. And for whatever reason, I seem to be unique in the point, if they don't make the movie, okay, well, we'll do this, so I do it a different way. But it's all storytelling. But the question of, do they inform each other? Yes. I mean, I think the skills of a storyteller are essentially character, plot, narrative, voice, all of those things. If you're writing a play or a movie, there's no narrative. It's all character and scenes. Those are very powerful tools for any writer, nonfiction, anything that you would write. Once you've see it as a movie, even though you're writing it as a novel or a nonfiction book. If you see, the dramatic flow of this is going this direction, sometimes it's corrupting. There's no question that you want to have the Hollywood element in it, but building a character, the way that you would build a character for the stage or something like that, that's perfectly available to you. And then getting inside a character's mind in a nonfiction way, you can't make it up, but you can ask, what were you thinking? Did you have any dreams about it? Did somebody say something ugly to you at that moment? You can inquire, and then you can fold it into what a novelist would do and put it into a nonfiction book.
It is funny, because I do this as well. When you're interviewing people for this kind of thing, it can sometimes be very unsettling for them when you'll say stuff like, for me, I'm forever saying, what were you wearing at the time? Do you remember what it smelled like? These kind of, and it weirds people out a little bit, but when you want to create the scene, this is what you...
Yeah, my favorite of those was when I was interviewing bin Laden's brother-in-law, and I said, did Osama sleep in a bed? What? He's in a cave, In a cave, you don't sleep in the bed. But at home, he sleeps in the bed.
Can you talk to us just briefly, Larry, because you were talking about characters and building a character. I've heard you talk before about, I don't remember if it's a donkey or a mule.
Donkey.
But, okay, talk to us about the donkey. Tell us about the donkey.
It sounds like a term of disparagement, but a donkey is a beast of burden and very useful. And so you try to find a character. It's not the same thing as a celebrity profile. You want to find somebody who can take the reader into a world that reader has never been in. And a donkey carries a lot of information on his back. So if, like when we're talking about the looming tower, right after 9/11, I knew I had to write the story of my generation, but where to start? And I thought, I need a donkey. And I started going through the obituaries that were streaming online. And I found on the Washington Post site this short obit about John O'Neill, who had been the head of counterterrorism at the FBI in New York. They had the warrant on bin Laden. And he was fired from the FBI for taking some confidential information out of the office. And then he took a job as the head of security at the World Trade Center. So I thought, I don't know if he's a goat or a hero, but he's a donkey. You know, he can carry me into the FBI. He can show us why we failed. And I thought at the time, you know, that his was, you know, kind of a sad story. But actually, he told his friends, you know, because Al-Qaeda had bombed the World Trade Center in 1993, and they said, John, you're safe now because they already did that. And he said, no, they'll come to finish the job. And he came out of that tower and went back in.
Yeah.
My donkey.
Yeah, amazing. Well, can you talk to us about, I have so many questions about Stay True. Tell us, I mean, for people who haven't read the book, describe it, because it's not a conventional memoir.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book that
Would you even call it a memoir?
I mean, I guess if it has to go on a bookshelf at a bookstore, that's where it goes. But it's a book that I sort of began writing, not knowing that it would become a book, in the sort of hours after a good friend of mine was killed in college. And I think I was is pre kind of mental health therapy era. And so there weren't really many tools available to us, but our friends just all kind of were there for each other, and I sort of turned to the page. And I didn't at the time aspire to become a writer, but I knew that I would just see out this project that and I didn't know why, but I would just sort of compulsively write every night, just letters to him, stories. It was very sudden and terrible what happened to him. And for many years, that was sort of the engine for my writing. So whether I was writing like a 100-word review of an album for Rolling Stone or writing something with Village Voice, I would always think, I need to work on my like scenes, I need to work on my description, because someday I will come back to this writing about him, and I need to be able to describe like how he laughs, right, or what he looked like. And so I guess like when I was in my late 30s, I decided, you know, you've been thinking about him and thinking about this for so long, you should just sit down and do it. And so I went through these like hundreds of pages of journals I'd been writing, and it's not something that had ever shown up in the hundreds of pieces I'd written, even things that were personal. And I just sort of spent a year thinking about friendship and what it means to be at that pivotal moment in your 20s, you know, the kinds of things that made me who I was, like the kinds of things that make you sort of the emotional person you are, like what you inherit from your parents. And so it is a story about our friendship and about that moment, but it's also, I think, a reflection on just what it means to write about another person and what it means to imagine what it means to let someone who's no longer here grow and evolve on their own terms, if that makes sense. Because I think I was just so stuck like eulogizing him for so long that I was like, I have to be honest about why I feel compelled to do this. And so, yeah, it's a book about writing as much as it's a book about loss and grief and things.
Can I say something
Please,
about that?
yeah.
That I was so interested in that memoir because it reminded me of in biology class when you first get to look at a microscope, and you know there are different levels of intent, you know, closeness, you know, and so you look down at the, you know, whatever the roach or whatever they put on this slide, and then you click down, and then you get into another level, and then you click down, and you go into the molecules, and that's the way I felt. You were going in and out of these different lenses, and it was very. And then diving into philosophy, and all of this gets to the idea of literary nonfiction, because when you go into something like that, you have to give everything you have, and your voice is a big part of it. But assembling all these details and trying to structure an arc that carries the reader all the way through, those are the real tools that you need to have in order to pull that off. But your particular talent is going deeper than anybody would imagine.
Well, thanks. That means so much. You're actually reminding me of something. Not to turn this into like a New Yorker love fest, but there's this. When I was starting, I think the reason it took me 20 years to get around to writing is because there was no model for it. I was sort of like, there's a book that I want to read about my own life, but there's no obvious thing for me to copy. And I think when you're starting off, like I would just sort of look at people's pieces and copy them, and just sort of port over whatever I was doing, right? So I didn't know the donkey thing, but I was like unconsciously doing that too. And Bill Finnegan, another writer at the New Yorker, he wrote this incredible memoir, Barbarian Days, and it's about surfing, but he's this reporter, and he basically re-reports his life, or he reported his life by interviewing all these people, and then just wrote this like incredible work. And I remember when I started writing, I thought, should I do that? Should I go and re-report my life? But then I realized that the thrust of my book, or sort of what the kind of, I guess, angst or pain within it was more about memory and not about history. Yeah. Like it wasn't actually that I was hung up on the past as a set of facts. It was that I was lost in my own memories. And so I then decided, like, I can't actually re-report this. I need to just write this all from memory and then go back and figure out what was real and what wasn't.
I'm so glad you asked about this because it's such a perfect segue to what I wanted to ask next, which is so when we walked in here, Hua made an observation, which is like a very Hua observation. As we walked in, he pointed to all these DVDs. And he was like, God, this is really something. Like, look at this amazing collection of DVDs.
Yeah.
And many people would look at this collection of DVDs and say, all of this stuff is digital now. You do not need these physical DVDs.
What are those things?
Or what are those things, right? Exactly. Where do you even put it? Yeah. But so this is, it's interesting. When you write about other people, and you write about, so people who are alive now, but often you're asking them about things that happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's this kind of interesting thing where, Larry said earlier, we can't make anything up, right? And yet, you are often relying on their memory, and so there's a kind of artifice in the writing that I do, right? Where I'll interview somebody, and they'll be telling me about something that happened 25 years ago, and they'll say, and then she said, and they give me something in quotes, and then I said, and for me, that's kind of good enough. If I think that they're telling me the truth, and I think that they aren't just kind of making this up, and I feel as though their memory of this scene is vivid, I will then put that in quotes in my book. And there's an artifice here, right? Because clearly this is not a verbatim extract of a conversation that happened 25 years ago. I'm relying on their memory. And there's this sort of interesting thing when you're writing about people, which is that what you always want is somebody who's kind of a pack rat and kept everything. They kept every receipt. They wrote a journal entry that night and said, and then she said, and then I said. Anything that you can kind of, you can audit what they're saying. And what's so fascinating to me about your book is that you were somebody who kept a lot of things, for whatever reason, kept these little mementos. And so they have this kind of like runic value, but they also then in the book become these, I don't know, it's like almost a kind of Proustian thing, right? Where you're like excavating your own memories with the use of these memory aids. Do you see what I'm saying? Like you could be me who throws everything away, and when I sat down to write my version of your book, I'd be kind of out of luck. I'd be at the mercy of my own memory, which is not very good.
Yeah, wait, Patrick, you don't keep a journal?
I used to. I don't anymore. I know.
Wait, when and why did you stop? When you realize that someone might ask you these types of questions.
Yeah, exactly. No, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think it's going to be a weird thing to say, but I think for many, many years I kept a journal because I felt like my life hadn't really started yet, and I really wanted it to start, and then it started. I had kids. I started being able to do the things that I wanted to do with work and things like that. I kind of became the person that I am, and I stopped writing about it. It was too busy happening. What I spent years, and probably from when I was, 15 to when I was 30, waiting for it to happen impatiently and writing about all my hopes and dreams.
Yeah, it does get in the way, but.
Do you keep a journal?
Yeah, irregularly, but now more regularly. But actually what happened my kids said the most wonderful things, and I cherished them. I wanted to save them, and so I went back to writing my journal, and then kind of kept it up. And then I found that later on, when I wanted to write about a person or write a memoir or something like that, I already had, just as you had been storing up these nuts for winter, for much of your youth. I go back to it all the time, and it's a corrective on my memory. My memory is not good anyway, but to go back and find these things that were so meaningful, and encounters that I had, those, I have not ever read through it all again, but I dip into it every once in a while.
I should say, just parenthetically, we're in the Didion room right now, and some of you may have seen there's a piece in the New York Times today about the fact that Joan Didion, who wrote for the New Yorker as well, started to keep a diary at a certain point. I think she was in her 60s at the point where she did, and for several years kept a diary. I think coming out of some therapy that she'd been doing, she started keeping a diary. And when she died, her executors discovered these entries, all very carefully collated in a folder, in an unmarked folder in her desk. And they're going to be published as a book. But there's this kind of interesting question, which is whether or not Didion would have, because in other contexts, Didion had criticized the idea of sort of publishing posthumously the unpublished writing of writers who probably are, as we all are, sort of fetishistically controlling and wouldn't necessarily have approved. And yet at the same time, there's this kind of tantalizing idea that, she dies and she leaves them kind of chronologically, all laid out there for somebody to find without any, and she doesn't destroy them, she doesn't leave any instructions, she doesn't want to. Anyway.
Why don't you tell that quote that you told me the other day from that documentary?
Oh, yeah.
Since we're in the Joan Didion room.
I guess if we're in the Joan Didion room, some of you have probably seen, there's a documentary, I think on Netflix, that Griffin Dunn made about Joan Didion. And there's a really incredible moment in it where she's asked about slouching toward Bethlehem, and that moment where, the kind of indelible moment that everybody remembers, where she's in Haight-Ashbury and at the kind of height of the madness, and she's in the hippie house, and the little girl comes out, the 6-year-old girl, and she's dusted with PCP, her parents have angel dust, and so this little girl comes out and she's dusted with PCP. And Griffin Dunn, but behind the camera, asks Joan Didion, so you're there and you're in this house and this little girl comes out, she's dusted with PCP, and what did you think? And the camera's on Joan Didion, bless you. Camera's on Joan Didion, looking kind of bird-like and quizzical, and she says, well, what I thought was, this is gold. And I just thought, Larry and I were talking about how that's the kind of, that is, when you do this work, unfortunately, that is the instinct that you have, right? It's you're oh, how terrible, I should wipe the angel dust off this little girl, but also, this is gold.
Yeah.
Can I ask, we've only got about 6 minutes left. There's 2 things I want to ask about. One is, Larry, in 1998, this movie comes out. It's called The Siege. It was written by Larry Wright. It is about a terrorist attack on New York City by Islamist terrorists and the kind of dramatic overreaction by US authorities. And it is this kind of incredible little bit of prediction. It's pre-9/11, this very, very prescient movie, which I would recommend to you. So Larry wrote that. In April 2020, Larry publishes a novel called The End of October, which is about a global pandemic sweeping the world and quarantine and lockdown, and it comes out in April 2020. Next month, Larry is going to publish a novel about Israel-Palestine, and a novel that culminates in October 7th. And I wonder, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit, if you can, about this book, and then also tell us how do you do it and what's coming next.
No, I'm not a prophet, and I've been tagged with this. There are weird coincidences that happen.
I'll say.
Yeah, but typically when you're writing something like that, a reporter, his main question is, what happened? And so as a novelist, it becomes what could happen. So you use the same set of skills, you know, you look at the world and try to figure out where this is going. But I have spent a lot of time in my career in the Middle East. And it's such a tragedy. You know, you can't be in Israel and Palestine without having your heart bleed on both sides. And yet I'm so pissed off that it's lingered this long. It's, you know, when I said I was old, but in my lifetime, all these impossible things happened. Apartheid disappeared. The Soviet Union dissolved. We elected a black man president. They would never happen, and they did. And yet this goes on and on and on. So there's this resistance to peace, and everybody knows that war is not going to solve the problem, and yet the wars continue. So I had to get this off my chest. And I wrote a detective story that's set in Hebron, which is I started out covering the civil rights movement for the Race Relations Reporter, so I saw a lot of hatred, but I never saw it on the level that I saw it there. And I felt the world has to know, you know, all my characters, I think, are based on people that I've known. So they have an attachment to reality, which I think is the commonality that we have no matter what form we're writing in. We want it to be as real as possible, even if it's fiction. And so that's why I'm waiting for, there hasn't been a single review of it yet. There usually, a month ago I would have had, you know, the Goodreads and Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, and they'd all be weighing in, and there's this deathly silence. And so I'm wondering, you know, I'm on the, you know, if I were a prophet, I'd like to know, you know, what's next, because I know that, you know, the Knopf has the idea that it's going to be a big book, but it could be like a nothing burger because, you know, nobody wants to get close to it. It's harsh.
Yeah. I mean, there has been some other stuff happening in the news a little closer to home, but which may be part of it. But but I have a feeling we'll all be talking about it in a few weeks' time.
We'll see.
Let me just quickly ask, in the minutes we have left, one thing that I think that I wrestle with is that 25 years ago there were a lot of outlets that did the kind of work that we do, and you could, if you were a young person, you know, you could get a job doing this and sort of have the expectation that you were going to be able to spend decades of your career and raise a family and what have you, and kind of make it all work. And the business model has changed really dramatically, and I think the habits of readers have changed dramatically. And I just wonder, how you guys, I sort of assume that you share my sense that what we do in some ways is like it's a fragile thing and it may not last forever, and I wonder how you reconcile that day to day, loving it as you do and doing it every day. And tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, if you're like totally bullish on the future of long-form magazine journalism, I want to hear that too.
I mean, I think that the impulse that makes people want to do it is still very rich and present. It just is taking different forms. And I think the biggest fear I have is, you know, people make podcasts or do other or like documentaries are bigger than they've ever been. I just hope that level of kind of professional rigor, which was used to be the norm, is sort of retained as well. But I mean, I guess personally, I just try and do as good a job as I can and hope that it matters. But you know, I think the students I teach, they're still interested in storytelling, in understanding the other, and in understanding the world, but they're doing it elsewhere.
I think what disturbs me is that, you know, there's a kind of tier level of, you know, local newspapers, you know, then statewide publications, and then, you know, the kind of marginal, I shouldn't use that term derogatory, but magazines that are not that popular but are stepping stones. And then, you know, we're fortunate to play in the major leagues. But you can't have the major leagues without the minor leagues.
Yeah.
And, you know, these local newspapers are being pulled up by the roots. So the discipline of writing is what's disappearing. And, you know, that magazines do occupy a very interesting between level. You know, between a book and between a brief article, you have this juicy, flexible medium where many voices are allowed and people learn about things. It was kind of abandoned. And that's the magazine world, and that we were lucky to have been a part of it in something of a golden era.
Here, here. Well, on that note, I want to thank Hua and Larry. Thank you all.